Well, thank you all for coming to the the China panel. I'm Gordon Chang. Oh, that's better. Let me try that again without the mistakes. Thanks for coming to the China panel, and I'm still Gordon Chang. Although no state threatens China, China is rapidly building up its military. And the Chinese military, like the Japanese one in the 1930s, is rapidly gaining power, political power. So, as a result of this, China is threatening not only its neighbors, but also the United States and indeed the entire international community. Now, many analysts, many people worry that China is going to become the dominant state in the international system in the 2030s and the 2040s, and so they worry and concerned about that time. But there are also people who are looking at an earlier period, the 2020s. So Jim Finnell, retired U.S. Navy captain, chief of intelligence for the U.S. Pacific Fleet. You talk about the 2020s as the decade of concern. So why the 2020s?
This decade of concern is bracketed around this belief that and understanding that China is on a timeline for their great rejuvenation and the restoration of China to its rightful place. And so you have to accept this and understand that China's not just taking the long view and kicking the can down the road for another century. They're actually on a very detailed timeline to restore themselves to what they believe is their right place in history in the world and the world order. And so they have published and stated that they want to, by 2049, celebrate the second centenary goal, which is the 100th anniversary of the People's Republic of China. And in order for that paramount leader of the Communist Party of China in 2049 to be able to stand in front of the Forbidden City and declare to the people of China that they have been restored and rejuvenated, they're going to have to be able to have resolved the territorial disputes that they have with Taiwan, with the Senkakus, with the South China Sea, with disputed territories with India, and with even Vietnam. And so China would prefer to resolve these things through what they call comprehensive national power, using diplomacy, information, economics. But they also have planned and built this military to be able to, if these other non-kinetic forms of power are not successful, to be able to use their military to take these territories by physical force. So with that understanding, we all in the intelligence community know that the Chinese leaders, Hu Jintao and Xi Jinping, ordered the PLA to be able to have the capability to take Taiwan by 2020. That's next year. So for the last 20 years, the Chinese have been modernizing their military across the board to be able to have the capability to take Taiwan starting as early as next year. So the question becomes, how late can you use military force and still expect the world to come to Beijing in 2049 and have a big celebration about the great rejuvenation of China? And I believe that China has viewed a period of history in our past, the time between Tiananmen Square in 1989 and the Beijing Olympics in 2008, which is basically 20 years. And if you recall, in 1989, the world condemned China's barbaric actions of running over their own citizens in Tiananmen Square with tanks. And the world said that is not acceptable behavior, and we've shunned them to a degree. Just 19 years later, though, on August 8th, 2008, in Beijing, in the Bird's Nest Auditorium, where there were 80,000 people there. And at the top of that Bird's Nest stadium, we had air-conditioned skyboxes, and Hu Jintao was the chairman of the Central Military Commission, president of China, and he was there with the 8 other standing committee members of the Politburo. And they were in their Mao suits, and they were cool, and they were calm, and they were collected. And if you recall this opening ceremony, it was a fantastic ceremony, but it was August 8th, and it was 95 degrees Fahrenheit, it was 95% humidity, and in that audience of 80,000 people, as they were watching this great display and the drumming and all that, Hu Jintao looked down and could see one person, And this person had their suit coat off, their tie was off, and had big sweat stains underneath their armpit. And that person was George W. Bush. And the message that that sent to China was, in 1989, the United States condemned China for their barbaric actions, and 19 years later, the President of the United States was getting a ticket to sit down in the audience to watch them do their Olympics. So if you back up 20 years from 2049, you get to 2030. That's probably the last time that they can use military force and fully expect that the world will forget about their violent actions and celebrate in 2049. So that decade is the decade of concern.
So we're looking at a period which starts basically now.
It's now.
And continues for a decade where the Chinese might lash out, do any number of different things. So Rick Fisher, as you look at the capabilities of the People's Liberation Army, you know, if we were to project out in terms of building rates for the Navy, which Jim has talked about, you would think that at some point the Chinese Navy would be just so big they'd be able to overwhelm us. But in the 2020s, in other words, in the immediate future, do you think that the PLA can take on the U.S. Navy in its peripheral waters and still win?
Well, first, Gordon, a great many thanks to you and CPAC for organizing this panel. And yes, when it comes to the decade of concern, Jim, I'm also a pessimist. Once the Chinese start moving, they're just not going to stop. Taiwan, the Ryukyus, taking on the South China, controlling the South China Sea. Eventually, they'll be taking on the Russians and the Indians. It'll just be a nonstop. It'll be a century of war that emerges if we don't deter them in the decade of concern. But Gordon, to answer your question, in the 2020s, we are already facing a great danger. About 15 years ago, in conferences devoted to studying the People's Liberation Army, somebody might bring up the issue of, well, they're going to invade Taiwan, aren't they? There would be laughter from the professionals. The professionals came up with this little cute, oh, invading Taiwan, well, it's going to be a million-man swim. Ha, ha, ha. Today, in my opinion, the Chinese can put about 6 million people on Taiwan within a month. That is, if they take all the airfields and if they are successful in mobilizing about 100,000 barges that steam up and down China's large rivers, they can put millions of people on that island and effectively pacify it. Right now, the Chinese have just put 1 million mid-level officials into Xinjiang. Why? So that a Chinese official can live in most of the households in Xinjiang. Why? To report, to educate, and if anything happens to that Chinese official, you can just imagine the retribution that will be visited on that family. On Taiwan, the operative number is 8.6 million. 8.6 million families. Yes, the People's Liberation Army can put 8 million people on that island in probably a little over a month. This means that for the United States, we must remove the ambiguity in our commitment to that island. We must be very far-thinking in the capabilities that we sell to Taiwan. The Taiwanese don't want us to fight their war. They know that they can win it if they have the equipment. And today, that would require roughly 10 or 20,000 low-cost anti-ship cruise missiles that would not overburden their budget. For the price of a squadron of F-16s, they could probably amass the thousands of cruise missiles that would really speak more directly than anything else to Xi Jinping and his generals not to give it a try.
So Frank Gaffney, Center for Security Policy here in Washington, D.C. What Rick just talked about really was political will in terms of easy things that the United States could do to prevent the Chinese from crossing the Taiwan Strait. Do you see that political will in this town at this particular time?
I have the feeling that political consensus about the sorts of things that we've been talking about has begun to emerge in this town. That's not the same thing as political will necessarily, but it is a precursor to it. It is a necessary, if not sufficient, condition to it. It's bipartisan. It is, I think, informed increasingly by the sorts of evidence that these gentlemen have been generating and many others besides in the White House, in the U.S.-China Economic Commission, in the Trade Office, in Congressional Research Service, the DNI, and on and on. And unfortunately, I guess that's the good news. The bad news is that the evidence is now so overwhelming that the China threat that we're here to discuss is real, has become inexorably more and more aggressive and more dangerous. And so I think what comes of that, Gordon, is a choice. Do you surrender, or do you have the will to fight? And not necessarily fight in the kinetic sense, at least initially. It may come to that for the reasons that these gentlemen have talked about, but that's the choice before us if this consensus that I think is emerging takes hold.
Jim, what Frank just talked about in terms of changing consensus, I've heard senior Navy officers say, look, we don't have a chance against the Chinese, and then the next sentence basically is, we're just not going to fight them. I mean, your comments about that.
I think, as Frank alluded to, Gordon, there is a changing consensus. I've been here a week, and I spent some time in the Pentagon on Monday with the OPNAV staff, and the message that came across to me was that there is a complete recognition of this threat, which was, 5 years ago when I retired, that wasn't, the consensus wasn't there. So I think it's there. It's just a matter of the resources that are going to be given to the Navy to be able to build the kind of fleet that we need to be able to confront and deter the PLA Navy, as they are the front end of this counter-intervention strategy that would keep us away from defending our allies in Asia.
I'd like to bring the audience in soon, and there'll be a microphone for people. But before we get to that, just one quick question, and that is, you were in the Navy at a time where they almost seemed to look at China as a continuing partner, not as an adversary. And you didn't hear senior Navy admirals say, look, we've got to prepare against the Chinese. It was more, we got to partner with them. Is that going to change quick enough? I mean, because yes, it's changing, as Frank points out, but the issue is, are we going to make those changes fast enough so that we will be able to prepare, so that we will be able to defend Taiwan and other things?
I think this administration has opened up the possibility for the leadership of the military and the Navy in particular to be more vocal in making these statements. But heretofore, they have not been. And we had a policy of essentially unconstrained engagement. And that has to change because of this issue of time. Time is not on our side. China is on a schedule.
Yeah, and this is the important point of what you guys have just said, which is this is an issue of our ability to gear up fast enough. We geared up very fast in World War II, but the nature of warfare has changed that we probably are not going to have the opportunity to do that again. Questions from the audience? Could you get a microphone to this guy over here? Yeah.
Hi, Frank De Barona, Bay of Pigs veteran from Miami. China now has developed weapons to bring down our satellites with lasers and different weapons. How can we protect our own satellites from China? How can we prevent them from continuing to stealing our military secrets and industrial secrets, which they have been doing for a very long time?
Okay, there's a two-part question. First, I'm going to start with Frank in terms of cyber, because obviously the Chinese have been cyber attacking us, and they've been stealing secrets, among other things.
When I was here last year, I actually started off my remarks by saying China under the Communist Party has been at war with the United States, probably for 2 decades at least. We haven't been at war with them. In fact, we've, as we've just been discussing, haven't even recognized that they've been at war with us. One of the most obvious places in which that warfare has been conducted in sort of the larger rubric of economic warfare is in the cyber domain. And, you know, there's been a lot of talk lately, both in sort of specific examples as well as the context of the deal that we're told is in the offing, that something has to be done about China's use, among other techniques to be sure, but specifically of cyber means of thieving, stealing, otherwise expropriating our intellectual property. And it's the intellectual property of corporations, including tech firms, including defense contractors, the financial sector, it's the government, OPM being but one example. And not least, and particularly worrying to me, I must say, is what the Chinese are doing with cyber in our infrastructure, including most especially the most critical of the critical infrastructures, which of course is our electric grid. And all of that, Gordon, is happening today, has been happening for some time. Some estimates run as high as $540 billion per year being ripped off by the Chinese through cyber. But watch this space, because imminently there are decisions with respect to fifth generation wireless technology, 5G as it's called, artificial intelligence, quantum computing, that will make the kinds of operations the Chinese have run against us in the cyber domain to date pale into insignificance.
Yeah, there will be a main stage panel on 5G and on artificial intelligence, which will cover these issues that Frank's talking about. As I mentioned, that was really a two-part question. The first part was about anti-satellite weapons the Chinese have. Nobody knows more about this than Rick.
Yes. China has been preparing for war in outer space at least since the late 1980s. In about 1986, Deng Xiaoping told the People's Daily, "We are against anybody who is for war in outer space." That was his response to Ronald Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative. In about 1987 or so, the Democratic Party-controlled Congress defunded Ronald Reagan's defensive anti-satellite weapons program. By the 1990s, the Chinese are working on anti-satellite missiles, anti-satellite lasers, and laying out the beginning of their plans to control the Earth-Moon system. We are now in a race back to the moon with China. Late last year, China unveiled a new space launch vehicle, and weeks after that, unveiled a new architecture for sending its astronauts into the moon orbit, the cislunar orbit, and is revealed a new lightweight 5-ton moon lander that will go between the moon satellite space station, small space station, and the lunar surface.
So that's the high ground to space.
And when China goes to the moon, it won't be one great leap for mankind. It will be a great leap for the People's Liberation Army. They already have plans and intentions to militarize their presence on the moon.
And Rick, you pointed out something 2 or 3 weeks ago when I heard you on a radio program, and you mentioned that the United States does not have a deployed weapon to knock down Chinese satellites, but that the Chinese have deployed weapons to knock down ours.
Indeed, they have deployed ground-based, stationary, and mobile anti-satellite laser devices. They have multiple types of mobile, ground-launched anti-satellite missile interceptors. The United States, at least as far as has been publicly revealed, has no deployed anti-satellite weapons.
So take that on board. The Chinese can knock down our satellites, and we're going to fight a war without ours. So,
Gordon, could I just make one
Sure.
quick point on this? Because the picture that this paints is of space assets being compromised or neutralized. Unfortunately, as Rick knows so well, that's only part of the story. Our ability to fight wars on the earth, as well as do infinite numbers of commercial activities, our economy, in short, depends upon who controls space and what use is made of it. So this is a much bigger problem than just satellites.
So Captain Fennell, can the U.S. Navy fight in an environment where they do not have access to space-based assets?
No.
Next question. In the back.
Can't get there from here.
While we do that, let me just mention that when we think about the capabilities of the U.S. Armed Forces, we think of this invincible force, but we have allowed the Chinese to make great advances while we have degraded our own capabilities.
I gave a short answer, no, but I mean, a little meat on that bone, which is we rely on the global positioning system to provide locational data for all of our ships and aircraft and submarines and all the weapons that fly off of these platforms. The Chinese have plans to take out the GPS system, while over the last 20 years they've built their own system called Beidou, and Beidou 3 was just fully operationalized this last year, and it's a global positioning capability. So the Chinese will take ours out, blind us, make our weapons ineffective, while they will still retain that capability.
Okay, question over here.
Yeah, I arrived a little late, so I apologize if I missed this, but I was curious for your thoughts, and maybe Mr. Gaffney, your thoughts on the prison camps China has set up in the Western China for Muslims.
What's happening is a humanitarian disaster of the first order for those who are being incarcerated. And it's just the latest evidence of the Chinese intolerance for all religions, specifically, in this case, the Muslims, but what they're doing to Christians and Buddhists and others is not a whole lot better. And the scale, as you mentioned, of 1 million people estimated now in a gulag kind of concentration, infrastructure in Zhejiang is staggering, but it's also instructive. Any country that treats its own people this badly is unlikely to be terribly considerate of ours.
And let's put a point on this. These are concentration camps that are reminiscent of those of the Third Reich, and people are dying in those camps. There's about 1 million, maybe 1.5 million people there. Some people say 1.1, but the point is that this is the greatest crime against humanity in the world today, and we don't seem to be talking very much about it. There's a question over here.
How are the Chinese using the corporations and technologies such as Huawei and Xiaomi to advance their military agenda?
Okay, the question was about Huawei. Frank, that's probably yours.
There's a lot of talk about Huawei suddenly, as you probably are aware. Huawei is, of course, a conglomerate that has been built over the past 2 or 3 decades by a former officer, I believe, in the People's Liberation Army, a man with very close ties to Xi Jinping and to the Communist Party leadership. It is, I believe, no exaggeration to say, it is an instrument of the Chinese Communist Party and of its military. They profess not to have anything to do with it. They're shocked that anybody would suggest that they might actually allow information they obtain through the use of their hardware, for example.
This is not theoretical, Frank. In the headquarters of the African Union, which China donated,
Right.
for 5 years, from 2012 to 2017, every night, data was downloaded from the computers and the servers in Addis Ababa, sent back to Beijing. It was Huawei equipment that was used.
Of course. And it will continue to be on demand, available, and check into this panel that we'll be talking about 5G, because they are poised to dominate that worldwide network. And if they do, you can bet the complications, the implications, I should say, for not just the military of China, but the whole operation will be grave for the rest of the world.
You know, 5G is going to connect everything, your car, your home, your toaster. All of that information being downloaded to Beijing every night is really what we're talking about.
If you really want a nightmare, though, consider 5G plus your future brain chip that the tech titans want to plant in our heads for all sorts of good reasons.
Actually, a brain chip probably would help my performance. But anyway, this guy over here.
Thank you. Salih Hidayar with the East Turkestan National Awakening Movement. On the concentration camps, what's stopping the United States from sanctioning Chinese officials in regards to this? I mean, essentially, there's a genocide, and then part two of my question is, wouldn't it be wise for the United States to include occupied East Turkestan, Tibet, and Central Asia, and even Hong Kong and other occupied territories by China into America's grand strategy to counter, to deter the Chinese threat?
Well, the answer to your first question is political will. We don't have it. The second answer to your question is really going to be, we should be doing this because the Chinese are talking about Hawaii being independent. They're also talking, you know, you're in the Navy, you were in Okinawa. They're also trying to separate the Ryukyu chain from Japan. So, you know, China has grand ambitions. We should return the favor. There's a question over here. Right there.
What do you see the allies in the region, like Japan, South Korea, Philippines, Australia, New Zealand, playing their role militarily if necessary or politically? And do you think the Chinese are going to do it in really small bites so as not to drag it into, let's say, a global war or into a massive sort of regional war involving them, India, and the United States?
I'll address that and then follow up with you all. But I think the short answer is China has been effectively taking advantage of 8 years of American negligence in supporting our allies and friends in the region. And I will draw your attention to the events of April through June of 2012 in what is called the Scarborough Shoal Incident. This is 140 miles northwest of Manila. It's in the exclusive economic zone of the Republic of the Philippines, and they are our treaty ally. And in April of 2012, the Chinese got upset that the Filipinos were reviewing the area and found some Chinese commercial vessels stealing resources from this shoal, giant clams and other things, corals. And the Chinese sent an armada of about 10 or 11 Coast Guard ships and PLA Navy vessels that were over the horizon. And for the next 3 months, from April through June, the United States State Department led negotiations between the Philippines and the People's Republic of China to resolve the issue. And what happened is that our State Department at that time and the people in charge made a grave mistake, and they arranged for both sides to leave at the same time, and ended up the Chinese did not leave, the Filipinos left, and since 16 June 2012, the People's Republic of China has had sovereign control over Scarborough Shoal. That is the greatest foreign policy disaster in Asia for America since 1975, when Marine Corps helicopters were taking off of the embassy rooftop in Saigon. We destroyed our credibility with our allies in the region over that event. And this administration has been working diligently to buy that back, even in the face of some hard challenges like within the Philippines and other areas. So we have a lot of credibility to work back after that event, but I think this administration is working on it, despite what you may read in the paper about, you know, the lack of support by allies. I think that our allies are understanding that we haven't given up on the region.
Rick, yeah.
Jim provides a very powerful, specific micro example, but I would like to take you up to the macro a bit. China, for 30 years, has been assiduously gathering economic power in all regions of the planet, using this economic power to gather political networks, and is convincing today convincing those political networks to begin military cooperation to proto-alliance cooperation with China. In Central Asia, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization started as supposedly an economic cooperation organization. All it produces is military exercises. Last July, the Chinese announced a forum, a military forum that includes every country on the African continent, a forum controlled by the People's Liberation Army. It is the beginning of a second proto-alliance. And they are working, they make no bones, publicly working to form a similar forum in all the countries of Latin America and the Caribbean. On top of this, China is working on a power projection military, an aircraft, a Navy that will eventually have anywhere from 10 to 15 aircraft carriers by the 2040s, 2050s, an air power projection air force, hundreds of large transport aircraft, and army forces, medium weight and lightweight, that can be deployed to advance China's goals or attack America's goals around the world. And this is the challenge that your children and your grandchildren are facing. And the reason why some of the things that President Trump has done, we can talk about those, are so very important and why they must be continued.
Just very quickly, to flog the coming attraction in this room right after this meeting is one that Gordon will be, I believe, chairing as well on Korea. The answer to your question in part is going to be whether other countries of the region follow the separate peace path that I believe Moon Jae-in of South Korea is now embarked upon with North Korea. And I would just say, I personally am extremely heartened, and I have the feeling that the good guys in this region, and indeed elsewhere around the world, were by President Trump taking his dishes and dolls and going home today.
Yeah, that was a great thing.
We've seen this administration cast doubt on continued foreign aid. Has this opened up the developing world to China's Belt and Road Initiative and their loan traps? And what can the U.S. do to curb the success of their Belt and Road Initiative?
Oh, you know, that's a fantastic question. And I think that essentially the issue is going to be the sustainability of that Belt and Road Initiative. The Chinese can say that they want to connect the world and bring it all back to China, but a lot of that infrastructure is infrastructure that the private sector wouldn't build. When I was in Hong Kong, I didn't do infrastructure work, but my firm did. And I know that everything that could be financed, could be banked, was indeed done so. What China is building is everything that the private sector didn't want to build. And you're starting to see in Beijing right now a lot of people saying, oh no, you know, we just don't have the money to do this. And especially when the Arctic ice cap recedes, you're going to see more shipping across the northern coast of Russia. That's going to make China's railroads through Central Asia completely uneconomic. There's a question over here. This woman, please.
You mentioned Africa, but I'm curious about how close they are in Mexico and Cuba.
Who wants to do this one?
Well,
And add Venezuela.
China, of course, is the largest outside source of support for the Cuban communist regime, the Venezuelan dictatorship, and for other left-wing regimes in Latin America like Bolivia. It's a real problem. From about 2009 to about 2015, China was trying to rearm the left-wing anti-American regime in Argentina, to rearm them so that they would have a second go at the Falklands. The only military capability that was exported to Argentina, and it's still there, is a space tracking and control station down in the southern part of Argentina. That space tracking and control station enables China to conduct warfare in outer space, to conduct cyber war against the United States and the rest of the world. And if China should succeed in starting the rearmament of Argentina, it will probably be enough pressure to force our ally in London to consider surrendering, turning over the islands, 50 years, whatever. That would be not a victory for Argentina, that would be a victory for China. And doors would open all up and down Latin America and the Caribbean. That is, if we let it happen.
Jim, that's our satellite tracking station. Navy is on it or not?
We're aware of it, and I mean, these are issues that are maybe beyond the scope of this room, but I mean, we're aware of these things and how you deal with them through various means and capabilities. I would just add on in this Latin America question, we're seeing more and more Chinese Navy vessels. They had a hospital ship that operated for several months this last year in the Caribbean, and I expect at some point in the near future, you're going to start seeing Chinese intelligence collection vessels operating in the Caribbean and more closely to each of our coasts, because they're very frustrated that we've been operating inside the first island chain in the Western Pacific.
Question over here.
Scott, I just want to respond really quick to what you sound like is what you're describing the Nazi Third Reich when they moved to South America as well. Two-part question: what's the timeline on this? What it seems like it's a slow crawl for China, maybe 60 years out, 100 years out, or is there going to be a Pearl Harbor type event? It's going to be D-Day or something like that, and we're just going to start.
Wow, what a question. My quick answer would be, I don't think the Chinese want to start World War III. Not like the Japanese military in the 1930s, which actually decided it was going to initiate conflict. But, as Jim can tell you, the Chinese intercept our planes and our vessels in very dangerous maneuvers. The last one was, last September or so with the Longzhou, a Chinese destroyer, came and crossed the bow of an Arleigh Burke, one of our destroyers, by 75 yards? 45 yards? Crossed the bow of our destroyer 45 yards. Any sense of miscalculation in terms of speeds would have been a disaster for us.
In terms of the timeline, about a decade ago, a little over a decade ago, a very scary ditty started appearing on Chinese nationalist and military-oriented web pages. It was basically a list of the necessary wars that China has to fight in order to reach the stage of national rejuvenation. Sometimes there's 6, sometimes there's 7, sometimes there's 9 wars. But they're listed, they're in sequence, and this is what average patriotic Chinese are reading on their military education interest web pages.
Frank, your comments on that?
Well, I agree with all this, but just one other data point. A lot of wars start by miscalculation. And what I think we're all concerned about is that the Chinese military, which has now been built up to such a point where, as Gordon started out by saying, it not only has prodigious offensive capabilities in the various domains. We've talked about space, we've talked about land, sea, air, cyber. But there will be a temptation, I think there's no question, to use them, maybe for internal control purposes, if not to secure foreign objectives. And one of the other things that my colleagues might want to just say a word about is...
Which we don't have time for.
Which we don't have time for, so I'll say it, is increasingly there have been now remarks by senior Chinese People's Liberation Army officers calling for military action against the United States. So Gordon may be right, as Sun Tzu taught, win without having to fight, but the evidence increasingly, I think, is they're preparing to.
We got time for one more question. You sir, please.
How you doing? How do you protect American interests / assets in the South China Sea against Chinese aggression?
Could you repeat that again?
How do we protect American interests in the South China Sea against Chinese aggression?
You have to have presence. We have to be there. We are forward deployed military. We have, forces in the U.S. 7th Fleet that are home ported out in Japan and patrol those waters. We need to continue to beef that up with more naval presence, more naval platforms, more aircraft, more relationships and exercises with ground forces. And so we cannot deter the Chinese or provide protection for our allies if we are not there. So we have seen in the last 2 years under this administration a great increase in not just these freedom of navigation operations, which you hear about frequently, but also in carrier operations, dual carrier operations between the United States and the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force or the Royal Navy. And so we're starting to remind China that we have been in these waters, and we're there not to control them, but we're there to make sure that people have free access to markets and freedom to buy and sell and trade. And that's the assurance and the deterrent credibility that we have with presence.
Okay.
Just one last thought, quickly. I had a small role in helping Ronald Reagan take down the last totalitarian, ideologically motivated regime that tried to take us down. We need to dust off how he did that. There's a marvelous national security decision document, 75, that laid it out in a highly classified form at the time, and he implemented it. It was not just about defensive operations or presence, it was about taking on the Soviet Union. I believe we need to do the same as he did. Not militarily, if we can, but we must do it comprehensively with all instruments of national power.
Okay, this is the lightning round. From each of you, I want a 1-minute answer on whether we can get through Jim Finnell's decade of concern, the 2020s, without a war with China. I'm going to start with Frank.
I wouldn't put a high probability on it, but again, it's a function, I think, not of us starting it, but of us preventing the Chinese from thinking they can benefit from doing so.
Rick.
Yes, we can. We take full advantage of the end of the Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Agreement. We start building our own arsenal of medium and intermediate range missiles, ballistic and cruise. We move smartly to arm the Space Force, and we make clear to our allies that we will share new technologies if you too are also threatened by China.
And Jim Finnell.
I am hopeful that we can if the United States of America wakes up and understands that this is an ideological struggle between a nation that says and believes, I live, you die. And we haven't educated the American public on that concept. And we are facing an existential threat. And the American people need to know from shore to shore that their lifestyles will change if China is able to achieve their goal of the great rejuvenation and the restoration of China.
I think that, as Jim said, this is an existential threat. The American people are not prepared to deal with it, but this will be the challenge, not only for our generation, but maybe later ones as well. Before we thank this cast of rogues, I want to say that within 10 minutes, we're going to start a new panel with South Korea, the possibility that South Korea could be lost to the free world. But before then, join me, please, in thanking these three fine gentlemen.